Now, it's lucky for all of us that that rational nature part is put the way it is. Because if it were to say an individual human being exhibiting the qualities of a rational nature, well, then we'd be in trouble. But it doesn't say that. It says all you have to do is prove that you possess a rational nature. That is, a nature that can be rationally understood in its functioning by somebody. And lo and behold, what has happened in the course of the last couple of decades? All unexpected, really, because I don't remember anybody predicting this was going to happen. We have unraveled the Word of God in our very flesh, in the very functioning of our material being. It's called DNA, our biology. And lo and behold, DNA has a way of letting us know that if we walk into a room and there's something left of somebody in the glass or on the table or on the knife or on the fork, you can test the DNA and you can say unequivocally all the markers of a human being used this fork, right? And more than that, the proof by which you do that is the result of our discovery using our empirical scientific methods and that understanding and reason God gave us. It's the discovery that we are indeed governed by a rational nature, a nature that we can understand with our reason in such a way as not only to identify that a human being is there, but we can tell you the quality, that's an individual, separate from any other individual you might find. Now, that's pretty striking. It's also very striking when you apply it to the situation of the child in the womb. You remember all the arguments these people used to use? Oh, it's just a mass of cells, it's not human, it's not, and so forth. Some people would say it's not really life. That was always wrong. The debate is not over whether it's life. Plants live, trees live, animals live. But this question is a debate over human life. And the debate over whether or not, from the moment of conception, the child in the womb is an individual human being, which is to say, a person, that debate is over. That debate has been settled as finally as any debate has yet been settled by our science. The answer has come clear and unequivocally. And even the abortionists don't deny it. I was watching a debate between an abortionist and a pro-life person a little while back, and the pro-life guy got up, and in a very good way, better than I just did, I think, he established that the scientific consensus was clear, that there was not any significant dispute on the fact that the child has all the markers of humanity from the moment of conception. And you know what the abortion doctor did? Some of you probably saw this debate, but the abortion doctor got up and, in lawyer-like fashion, though he was, in fact, I hate to call him a doctor unless you mean learned in the sciences of inflicting murder, but hey, I should, I suppose, give him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if people are willing to call me doctor, I should call him doctor, right? Anyway, this doctor, he got up, and in lawyer-like fashion, even though it wasn't a doctor of, it wasn't a JD, it was supposed to be an MD, but he said, I'll stipulate that. See, nice lawyer-like language. What does stipulate mean? I accept that. Isn't that remarkable? How many of you remember the battles we used to fight with pro-abortion people? And they'd stand us down, they'd yell, and eventually do what they do now in substitute for all argument. In those days, they actually did occasionally make arguments, Today, they just do the yelling and screaming. But before they got to the yelling and screaming in the past, they would actually try to stand you down. This was just a mass of cells, that this was not a human being, that you couldn't prove it. Now that it's proven, they've given up, they back off. And this the abortion doctor was saying, well, I've performed 10,000 abortions, and they're all legal. I haven't done a thing that's against the law. That's what he said. To which I would have to respond by starting our way toward the second little problem that we have here. And that second problem is, from whence does the Supreme Court derive its authority? The Supreme Court, as I understand it, derives its authority from the laws of the United States and laws passed in pursuance to the various provisions for the powers of the state governments and the federal government and so forth, and from those laws and from the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution. I haven't seen running around anything in the Constitution that says they have authority all by themselves. That in the absence of consistency with the Constitution or with the laws of the country that are and must be consistent with the Constitution, they have any authority whatsoever. So if they give an opinion tomorrow, and we sit down and read it, and it turns out to be manifestly contrary to the clear, plain language of the Constitution of the United States, is that law for us? Is that law for any government? Is that law for any institution? Is that law for any jurisdiction in the United States? It is not. And we are not only not obliged to accept it, we are, as they are, obliged to reject it. Now, it may not matter whether you or I reject it. But if the legislature rejects it or the executive rejects it, then it is rejected by another branch of government the same way laws passed by Congress or their provisions are rejected occasionally by the Supreme Court. Do you know what the lawyers and everybody else have forgotten? The power of judicial review is accompanied by an equal power of executive review and legislative review. Why? Because all three branches have an equal responsibility, not to one another, but to the Constitution of the United States. And if the Supreme Court judgment can be shown to be contrary to that Constitution, then it falls on the face of it. That's why, by the way, Blackmun wrote what he did in Roe. He wrote what he did in Roe because he knew good and well that if somebody stands up and proves that the child in the womb is a person, there's clear, plain language in the Constitution that says that you can't go around killing people, that you can't withdraw from people the equal protection of the law. You do understand that? See, because I don't think a lot of us have thought this through. We continue to accept that we must fight within the framework of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade has collapsed. The facts have collapsed Roe v. Wade. The Constitution collapsed it the moment that understanding of personhood was established, which now reigns throughout our judicial system. They cannot claim that they do not accept DNA as evidence of human personhood. They accept it now every single day. If it works for the accused murderer, then it works for the innocent child in the womb, and they have nothing more to say about it. The decision now is not up to them. The decision now is up to us and those who are elected to represent our good will. And I'd have to tell you, I applaud and sing praises to God for the perseverance of those who have been fighting against the injustice of this self-negating decision in the courts. You have done a yeoman's job. You have done a great effort. You have done a great service to your country and your God. But now it is time for the people of the United States to acknowledge the truth. The power has passed out of the hands of the Supreme Court. The authority that never was their authority has reemerged in its truth. And this decision must now be made, not by elitist judges, but by us, the people of the United States. Final point on this. I say this with even more conviction of its truth, because I say graced with the help of God. He opened my eyes to something that I had read 1,000 times but hadn't seen. You know how you can look at something, you read, you can even use it, you can think about it, but you don't see it. And I was in Uganda, of all places, helping out a friend of mine with some work that he's doing. He has been supporting the effort to try to eradicate malaria using certain means in Uganda for quite a while. And I went over at his invitation to sort of see what was happening and help out. And in the meanwhile, I had to write columns and do other stuff while I was over there. And I was writing a column that involved looking at and thinking through again the 3/5 clause. You remember the famous 3/5 clause? Or infamous, depending on who's talking about it? When ignorant people talk about it, it's infamous, racist 3/5 clause, because they don't realize what it was about. It was about making sure that the population of enslaved people wouldn't increase the political power of the slave states in direct proportion to the size of the enslaved population. So to reduce and weaken their ability to block legislation in the House. And it was actually a worthy motive. At the time, you wanted to keep the Union together on the principles that would ultimately invalidate slavery, and so you accepted a compromise that kept it alive, launched it, so that you could continue the battle to apply those principles. I think it was a worthy and correct compromise with not a trace of racism in it. And so what is the sudden insight that I had? Well, when you read the clause itself, it says that the population that will be used to calculate the proportion of representatives in the House each state gets will be based on the number of all free citizens, Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. Now, silly people. They are silly people. I'm sorry. They're tendentious, silly people trying to make their stupid argument that everything about America is racist and all of this without paying attention to the facts. That clause does not imply that black folks are 3/5 of a person because, you know, simple addition, right? The simple addition of whole numbers requires that each one you count be counted as one, not as 3/5 of one or this or that or the other. So every person was regarded, every black person would be counted, every enslaved black person would be counted as one. You'd add it all up, and then you would take 3/5 of that whole number, and that would be used to calculate how many people were added to the population. And so, for purposes of apportionment. But what does that mean, y'all? To understand the importance of what I'm about to say, you must remember who enslaved blacks were at the time. They were people whose humanity was seriously questioned, particularly by those who supported what was called at the time the slave power, right? So if you were in favor of slavery and the enslavement of black Americans, then you would make the argument that John C. Calhoun and others bold-facedly made that they're not human. They're no more human than my horse, than my donkey, than my cow. That was the argument. So humanity denied, yes? Even Jefferson was prone to believe that, well, yeah, they're human, and so his conscience was oppressed by the fact that the Declaration actually applied to them. But they're not as well developed. We wouldn't be doing them any favors because they're not fully developed human. We've heard this argument before in another quarter. And when you remember that, you see why I thought of this as such a special insight, because the class of people whose humanity is denied, right, whose development as human beings is questioned, and who are therefore, by some arguments, to be read out of the human race and therefore not classified as persons. Well, the Constitution doesn't agree with that conclusion that Blackman came to. He went through all those philosophers and practices of nations and states for nothing, because the Constitution had already applied the word persons to the class of persons to which nascent children self-evidently belong. See? Because there is a presumption of humanity that must be accorded to the nascent child in the womb, stronger and more self-evident than the presumption of humanity that should have been applied to enslaved blacks. See? And you would have applied it to enslaved blacks because they mostly look like other human beings. They have general features that resemble human beings, other qualities that resemble human beings. There could be a presumption of humanity. Should have been applied. But the child has an even greater presumption. Why? Well, because of the common sense that prevailed throughout human history. that if you get pregnant and you're a human being, I remember having a conversation with a young lady, I think it was the University of South Carolina, during one of my campaigns. And she came up and wanted to know why I was harping so much on abortion. We got into a back and forth. And at one point I looked at her and I said, well, imagine, just for a moment, that you should be right now carrying an offspring in your womb. Cats come from cats, dogs come from dogs, donkeys come from, etc. And so then a question arises. So if the child in your womb, if that sequence is true, right? Well, same thing from same thing in that progression. If that child in the womb is not a human being, what does that make you? You can bet that I didn't get an answer that night. See, I got a quizzical look, and she turned away to think more about that one. I wish everybody would think about it. See, so that means that by scientific empirical evidence of fact, by the common sense of human usage down through history, and finally by the usage of the Constitution itself, Blackmun was wrong then, and he is even more clearly and evidently wrong now. What? But aside, and I know that makes you feel good. Oh gosh, we've won. No, y'all, we didn't win. Because I don't know about you, but I don't even think that the most wonderful scientist among us takes credit for inventing, creating DNA. Do you? No. Somebody else knew what that DNA, knew it was there, knew how to read it, knew what it meant. See? So that part of the victory was already won. We just haven't discovered it yet. The common sense of all the ages was right there in front of Blackmun. Why he willfully ignored it, I will leave to God to ask him. As he weighs in the balance the millions of lives that have been slaughtered as the result of his dereliction. And then there's the usage of the Constitution itself, equally culpable from a jurist of his standing that he shouldn't even have bothered to discuss it. But I can't blame him too much because it took me a long time to see it. But I can excuse myself for saying that I had the advantage of never going to law school. So maybe that's why eventually I did see it. Who knows? But all of that comes together in such a way as to confront us with a very real challenge based on one simple premise that I think all of us need to stop being all prideful and self-absorbed and get to it. This battle was won at the very, like the word through whom all things were made. This truth was coextensive with the very first moment of creation. God knew all this time what a person was. And he demanded through all this time our respect for that person. Didn't he? Yes, he did. Maybe one of the reasons why he didn't have such a good opinion of child sacrifice. Things like that. But that also means that insofar as I can proclaim, and I do proclaim it, that the battle against abortion in the United States is over. It's over on grounds of God's authority. It's over on constitutional grounds. It's over on scientific, empirical grounds. But it was God's victory. All we had to do was accept it. And it's all we have to do now. See? We don't have to fight for it because they have no right to take it away. And if they claim that right because the Supreme Court makes the law, then they have overthrown our Constitution. No lawyers, no judges, no justices have the authority to do that. If it is to be overthrown, then it will be overthrown either by the violent destruction of those who hate its justice or the passive acquiescence of those who understand its justice but refuse to take a stand. Which are we now? For the battle has been recast. It is not a battle over a Supreme Court decision. It is a battle over the clear, plain language of the Constitution of the United States and the clear, plain responsibility from the president through every governor, through every law enforcement agent in this land to respect the Constitution's requirement that no person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, and that the equal protection of the law shall never be withdrawn from any person. We have withdrawn it from the babes in the womb without warrant, without constitutional authority. It existed all along, and we must now draw the line and dare them to step again across it. And if there is a governor, if there is the president, if there is anyone who claims to be pro-life in this country and bears the responsibility for executive power, who does not, the moment they understand this truth, shut down every abortion, murder, death clinic in their state, then pro-life is exactly what they are not. It is true, and I know there are folks thinking about it. Well, couldn't we do this kind of incrementally? Well, the problem with doing things incrementally is that in order to judge your progress, you have to have a standard, don't you? And in this particular case, the standard is the standard of the laws of nature and nature's God settled by science, and the standard of our Constitution, settled by the Constitution's own usage, and the standard of our common sense, endowed by God so that we can understand the laws and read constitutions. Yes? All three things agree. So exactly what standard are you applying to measure your increments? A standard that requires only one step. The same step that we all assume will be taken if someone steps into this room and starts to spray it filled with bullets until we are all of us dead. Do you think that the government should respond to that incrementally? Or should they go after the murderers and punish them? If they come into this room and herd us into a death chamber as the Nazis herded Jewish people into the gas chambers, would you suggest that you stop that incrementally, or that the laws of nature and nature's God require that it be stopped right away? Last time I looked, many, many thousands of Americans died because they thought incrementalism wasn't good enough to fight that kind of evil. Many Americans died on the battlefields of every war we have ever fought because they rejected that incrementalism, because they understood that that is the incremental destruction of our conscience, of our spirit, of our soul, of our union, of our country. But we still think that there's time. How much time would we think there was if the election in 2016 had gone differently? And if already, in addition to the people the courts have been throwing in jail because they refused to accept the abandonment of conscience, we were under the boot heel of a tyranny that threw us in jail because we dared to defy their lie that killing innocent children in the womb can be defended as a right. This battle is not joined because we want it so. It is joined because the truth requires it. because the only incrementalism is the one that wholesale accepts the lie that this can be justified in the eyes of God, the Constitution, or ourselves. So, time has come for a decision. And we have to make it. And it's not an easy one. It's the hardest one that any decent people ever has to make. The founders had to make it. Well, we forget sometimes, I think, that the colonies had existed in the United States by the time the War for Independence took place for quite a while. They had built up villages and towns and cities and farms. They had begun to build the kind of manicured prosperity that we are used to seeing when we move across this wonderful land of ours. You may think that we have more to lose, but what is more than everything, which they stood to lose more easily than we? Has their courage deserted us? Has their faith departed us? How do we prove it is still there, if not by standing as God tells us to stand? Not in the freedom to tolerate and do wrong, but in the liberty wherewith the righteous example of Christ has made us free. That is the liberty that does not come from doing nothing. It comes from doing right, according to God, even if it leads in the end to the sacrifice of your own life upon the cross of struggle and battle that has been needed and will still be needed now if we are to defeat the evil now threatening to overthrow our land. So when you are deliberating on this today, I think that you need to think about it, because it's a time for us to dig deep. We need to dig deep into our own consciences and into our own spirits, our own intellects, our own ways of applying our common sense. And as we do, we need to dig deeply into our resources so that the organizations we have formed as a result of the testing ground of judicial falsehood and travesty will continue to be filled as we stand for constitutional truth and justice. This we must do. And if the tea leaves are any indication, we don't have forever to do it, y'all. If 2016 had gone differently, which a whole lot of folks expected it to, we wouldn't have time to do it now. So we will either take a stand while we still may and pray to God that our peaceful advocacy of these truths will persuade the American people to relent in this Holocaust of murder. Or we will continue to play games with evil until evil wins, not just the House, but the Senate and the White House. And then a very different Holocaust will begin, the Holocaust of truth and conscience and right that brings on the destruction of these United States. And believe me, I sadly think that once the bad guys win this one, you really think they're going to allow for humanity to remember that once upon a time there was a nation with a government of, by, and for the people that worshiped not the righteousness of power, but the righteousness of God. And while they're inflicting their tyranny, they will just blithely go on telling them, "Hi, you used to be free." They will do everything in their power to erase the memory of our liberty and the existence of our nation. The choice will be made by them to erase us unless we now make the choice to take the stand that reestablishes the Word of God in truth. Will we do so? That's up to you. God bless you.